Connell. I'm from the Office of Research and Innovation, and I'm pleased to present Dr. James Purdy, who is an Associate Professor of English and Writing Studies here at Duquesne and the Director of the University Writing Center. He'll be discussing the journal article publication process and strategies for submitting a journal article. All right.
Thank you for the invitation to talk today. I'm pleased to be able to share some information about demystifying the journal article publication process and strategies for submitting journal articles. For this presentation today, I'm drawing on my prior experience as the associate editor for an international academic journal, as well as my current work as a member of two editorial boards, one for an academic journal and one for an open textbook series. And so my goal for today is to discuss strategies for submitting to a peer-reviewed academic journal, some things to know to help demystify that process, and to review the typical process of submitting a scholarly article for publication. What can you expect and what happens when you go through that? The strategies for submitting articles that I would like to share with you today are to target your efforts, to review explicit guidelines, to read recent examples, to consider the editorial staff, and to ask questions. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. When you're submitting and preparing a journal article for submission, it's helpful to have a specific publication venue in mind so that you're writing for a particular audience. So maybe think back to your composition course. If you remember, one of the components of the rhetorical situation, of course, is audience. And so having a defined audience can help you make choices when writing and ground your text in the needs of a particular group of people. This audience, of course, may change. It doesn't lock you necessarily into a particular venue, but it does allow you to make decisions that are geared in kind of the reality of actual readers. And I think ultimately you're more likely to be successful if you have that target in mind, rather than writing for a general sense of, oh, academic readers or scientists or humanists or whatever the population might be. It can allow you, as you are writing, to think about what the needs of your particular readers might be. The second tip is to review explicit guidelines. So in their publications, in print or online, or on their websites, journals provide information about what topics they cover, how they decide what to publish, and how writers should submit materials to be considered for publication. You want to make sure that you read those materials carefully when you're making a decision about where to target your work and when you're ready to make that submission. Make sure that your work is a match for the journal that you're writing for before you begin the process. And that will allow you to decide, okay, maybe I want to think about another venue that is more closely aligned with the work that I'm doing. You can sometimes think about whether your topic is something that they explicitly mention as a topic covered by the journal. You're more likely to have your work accepted if you have that match, and you can see that in the publication. Journals will also talk to you about what they expect in the kinds of publications that they will accept and that they will consider for publication. So in addition to kind of listing the topics that they have, they will indicate oftentimes kind of scholarly conversations into which they want the work to intervene and how they expect writers maybe to deal with particular marginalized or at-risk or underserved populations, or dealing with particular kinds of theoretical material and so forth. So it's good to do your homework and to take a look at what the guidelines are. And then the second half of that, of course, is finding out what you need to do when you actually get ready to submit. I'll talk more about that in the steps for the publication process in just a moment. But I do think it helps up front to kind of get a sense of, okay, I need to have an article that's going to be in a Word document or a PDF format, and I need to have my figures saved in a particular form, and I need to have them integrated into the text or whatever it is that it might be. I think the more in control you can feel about your process as you are drafting, the more likely you are to be a confident writer and to come across as a confident writer when you submit your work to a particular journal. The third strategy is to read recent examples of work that has been published in your target journal. Peruse the last few issues of the journal. You want to be familiar with it and the kinds of things that it publishes as you are preparing your work. So you want to pay attention to what topics are covered. What are you seeing these authors writing about? What are some of the common sources that are cited? If there are publications that you happen to notice, gosh, it seems like many people are referring to this particular book or this particular article, or I'm noticing this author comes up an awful lot. That can give you a sense of the necessity, perhaps, to look at that particular scholar's work. It's also helpful as you're looking at the last few issues of a journal to look at what the writing conventions are. So in other words, how do the articles read? Do they use passive or active voice? Is it common for writers to use the first person and refer to themselves as researchers and to situate themselves in relation to their work? Or is it more common for them to place an emphasis on what was done and not to introduce themselves into the process? It's also valuable to pay attention to how sources are integrated into the articles in the journal publication. And by that, I mean, what are the ways that authors reference other source material? Do they tend to summarize? Do they have literature reviews that have parenthetical citations that might list 5 to 10 publications that are on a particular topic? Or are they more likely to quote and to analyze the language of another source and to engage in kind of direct conversation with an author or with an organization? It's also helpful to pay attention to the tone. Is the discussion particularly passionate and contentious? Are references to other scholars collegial? Are they particularly pointed? How do you see that kind of cut across? And it's helpful to look at a number of articles so you don't rely too much on one particular author's style, but you can see something that's a little bit more characteristic of the work that the journal as a whole is more likely to publish. It's also useful to look at some of the last issues of the journal to consider what some recent trends are. Just to see what are the conversations that are kind of bubbling to the top in this journal. Are there recent current events that are showing up, or are there recent topics that really seem to be resonating? This can give you an idea about how you might want to situate your work in relation to recent work in the journal. I also suggest that you read the editor's introduction to note how they frame contributions and maybe what special issues or other work is forthcoming. If you notice, for instance, there is a special issue coming up on sociological responses to the pandemic or medical interventions with international vaccination distribution, then you might know, okay, wait, I'm a really good fit for that. And so this makes me more confident this is a good place to go. Or that may help you know, I may be looking like after the next special issue to get my work published in this journal if they have other things in the pipeline. It's also good to see how editors talk about the contributors and how they frame their work so that you can see how that editor kind of conceptualizes the work that's happening within the field. And this part of looking at previous issues of the journal also entails citing prior articles that are in the journal. You want to show that you are familiar with the journal and the publications in it. So you might be surprised how many authors submit work to a particular journal but don't have any citations to the work in that journal. And that absence tends not to bode particularly well, because you want to put your submission into conversation with other authors who have published in that journal and the particular issues that that journal engages with. If you find it really difficult to do that, or don't see it relevant to cite work that's been published in the journal, that's generally a good clue that perhaps this isn't a good venue for you, or at the very least that you need to read up a little bit about what other folks have published to see how you can situate your work into connection with that. Citing other work from the journal, of course, is not a guarantee of having your work accepted, but not citing any work that has been previously published in the journal is very likely not to get your article kind of moved forward within the process. The fourth strategy is to consider the editorial staff. It's valuable to attend to who the reviewers are for the journal and who is on the editorial board. So think about, what are their academic specialties? With what institutions are they affiliated? And what do they publish? So you may want to do a little bit of a kind of digging into the members of the editorial board or the reviewers to see the kind of work that they do, because it can give you an idea of, again, the kind of work that this journal publishes. It can help you determine if your article is a good fit. It also helps to acquaint you with the major scholars in that field who you might want to consider citing in your article. Again, this is a way to show that you have an awareness of who are the major researchers in this field and who are some of the folks that you want to show some awareness of. Obviously, it's never possible to cite all those folks, and it might not be relevant to do so. But I do think you put yourself in good stead if you show an awareness of, oh, yes, this member of your editorial board does work that aligns with the topic of this article that I'm submitting. And so I really want to make sure I make that gesture to that particular person's work. And so you generally see these lists on the websites for journals, or in the first few pages of the print publications, if it's a print journal. Sometimes it will just give you their institutional affiliation, as it is here. Sometimes it will provide you with a little bit more information. The final strategy that I want to touch on is to ask questions. If you aren't sure about something, you want to ask up front rather than making assumptions or kind of moving forward in the process without getting some confirmation or additional information. Editors and their assistants are usually very happy to field queries about something related to publishing in their particular journal. And so don't hesitate to do that. You do want to contact them via the channels for the journal publication rather than their university email or phone. It's just kind of a gesture of respect to kind of show that you're approaching them in that context rather than maybe approaching them as the instructor of a particular course at a particular university. Generally, you can find that contact information on the website for the journal, or again, if it's in print, it's oftentimes on kind of the facing page of the cover once you open that up. But you don't want to move forward if you're making assumptions about the citation style, for example, or about whether figures should be integrated into the text or put at the end, or whether you should be using headings, because you don't want to give the editor or reviewers any reasons to bounce back your article. And that's an easy thing that you can take care of with some additional information up front. You'll oftentimes get a sense of this information when you peruse previous issues of the journal, as I talked about in the prior tip. But if there's inconsistency or you just aren't quite sure, get answers to those questions up front. Okay, now that I've talked to you about some tips to consider for submitting journal articles, targeting your efforts, reviewing explicit guidelines, reading recent examples, considering the editorial staff, and asking questions, I want to move on to talk about the typical submission process. So to consider what happens when you are moving an article along when you're getting ready to submit something? What do you do? What happens? So the steps in the process that I want to talk about with you today are to submit an article with a cover letter, to receive confirmation of submission, wait, the hard part, the article undergoes peer review, to receive reviewer comments and a publication decision, revise, and resubmit. There are, of course, variations from this process for particular venues of publication, but these steps give you a general idea of what to expect when you submit a journal article for publication. And as with the strategies, I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Number one, submit your article and a cover letter. You want to, with your article, submit a cover letter that introduces it. Now, so much of submission now happens online that a separate cover letter may not work in the same kind of way. You may do this in a field on the submission form, or it may be part of a series of questions that you answer. But you want to have some material that introduces the article, that provides your identifying information, your contact information, that situates your article in the journal and in the larger field. When you submit your article for publication, you, depending on the field, want to remove all identifying information from the article manuscript itself. In other words, you want it to be anonymous so that readers don't know who you are when they're reading your piece. In some disciplines and for some publications, you may not need to remove identifying information. In some cases, if folks know the kind of research that they're doing, they know the set of folks associated with, maybe cutting edge research on something, so they may not require that. But usually you're going to be required to do so that you can maintain that anonymity, and there's no sense of favoritism within the reviews. You want to check, therefore, that the article doesn't give away your name, your institutional affiliation, or your geographic location. This is why you may have read in some publications that authors will refer to the place where they worked as a large Midwestern university, or a small liberal arts college, or a renowned Catholic university. That's a way to help kind of protect their identity. So you want to check that you don't inadvertently give that kind of information away if that's required. You also, at this stage, if your article is co-authored, want to determine the order of authors, who's going to come first, and then how the names will be listed after that. Make sure that there's agreement on that before it goes to the publisher, so that there isn't discussion about it happening later on in the process. This is because for a lot of disciplines, that order of authors is important in signifying the amount of contribution that someone made to the study and to the text. In other disciplines, it can also indicate someone's role in the process. So, for example, the first author might be the lead graduate student who was working on the process, and the last author might be the overseeing faculty member. And so you want to make sure that the authors are listed in the appropriate places, and that who the corresponding author is, that's all clarified up front for all of the folks who are working on the publication. So here's an example of a cover letter. I know the print on this is a little bit small, but I just want to use this to kind of show the parts that I'm talking about. This is from a publication of my own that introduces the piece and says, please consider this. In this article, I argue, so it situates the argument of the piece. This article contributes to recent conversations, debates about, and so it shows kind of how it's intervening in the field. And then it thanks the editor and kind of looks forward and lets folks know how that they can get in touch with you if they need to do that. The second step in the process is to receive confirmation that your article has been moved along in the publication process. And ideally, this notification says we have decided to send your article out for review, and this is the timeline you can expect by which to receive those reviews. Sometimes, unfortunately, this doesn't happen very quickly, and so don't panic if you don't hear anything right away. But at the same time, you don't want to wait too long, because you want to make sure that the article is not just sitting in some online queue or sitting on the editor's desk. So I encourage you, if you don't hear anything about your article has been received or your article has been sent out for review, in 3 to 4 weeks, to follow up with a gentle, polite check-in with the editor to let them know, I submitted my article on such and such a date. I'm just writing to check in about whether it has been sent out for review and what your timeline is moving forward. You don't want to just wait for 3 or 4 months and then find out the editor decided not to send it out, or that it's been kind of lost in the process. So you both want to be patient, but also be vigilant about making sure that your article continues to be on the radar of the journal. For a lot of publications, the editor's role is to decide initially whether to send something out for review. So the editor, in other words, will look at it first before it formally goes out to other folks to write more detailed feedback in response to the article. Editors generally do this to make sure that a publication is a fit for the journal before they send something out to reviewers, only to find at that point that actually this isn't a good match. And so you might hear relatively soon after if the editor says, hey, thank you for submitting, but I don't think that this is a good fit for our journal. You might want to consider these other journals. And so that means you can follow up and pursue those other journal publications. But you should be notified either way, whether the editor says, no, we're not going to move forward, or yes, we have moved forward. The next step in the process is to wait for peer review. So assuming that the editor has decided your article is a good fit and they have sent your article out, you'll now wait. Your article manuscript is usually going to be read by 2 to 3 scholars who specialize in your field. And editors will usually look for someone who's in your particular subfield that you're writing about. So, within the larger umbrella of biology, and you're writing about neurobiology, they're going to want to find someone in that specialty. Within the larger umbrella of literary studies, and you're writing about Edgar Allan Poe, the editor is going to want to find someone who's a Poe scholar. And so that there's someone who has expertise and knowledge about your particular topic. The review process is often what's called double blind, which means that you don't know who reviews your article, and the reviewers don't know who you are. Again, this is field specific. There are some fields in which this isn't conventional, sometimes in scientific disciplines, again, where it may be known who received particular federal grants. But in many cases, it is. Double blind reviews are usually part of some disciplines because they want to protect against any sense of favoritism, and they want to show that the decisions being made are not based on personal relationships. Sometimes journals will also ask reviewers to identify themselves to you. And so the process might not be double blind, but just be blind insofar as the reviewers don't know who you are. Some journals encourage this practice because they want reviewers to write in a way that is collegial and kind. And unfortunately, in some cases, when there's anonymity, reviewers may be a little bit more harsh in delivering their feedback. And so this is also not unusual for particular journal publications to let you know, okay, these are the people that did your reviews or that the reviews are signed. Sometimes it's up to the reviewer whether they want to let you know who they are or not. So after your article has been sent out for review and the reviews have been completed, the next start of the process is to receive comments. And this oftentimes will happen about 3 or 4 months after you have submitted your article for review. Again, this varies by discipline and by journal publication, but that's a general timeline that they ask reviewers to get their feedback back. So again, if you are not hearing after that time frame, it's not a bad idea to check in. Some journals may want to move the process forward more quickly than that. That's something that if it isn't clear to you, you want to check on with the editor when you make your submission. Most journals make one of 3 decisions when they return an article to you. And that is accept with specified revisions, revise and resubmit, or reject. If one of the former 2, you celebrate and revise. If the latter, you send it elsewhere. Sometimes these decisions are given in a different way. Again, there are variances with each journal. It may be revised with major revisions, revised with minor revisions, or reject, or even submit to another journal. And so those are calibrated in different ways. But if you get a request to revise, you should be really pleased. Do not expect your article to be accepted out of hand with no changes. It just doesn't happen. Even for folks who are renowned in a particular field, you're almost certainly going to be asked to revise. So if you are, there's a good chance that your article is going to be published. It means that there's potential that they see, and that they are hopeful that your article could be a good fit. So take heart if you receive those recommendations. It can be particularly hard, particularly on your first few reviewer reports that you receive from your articles, to feel like, oh my gosh, they want me to make all these changes. They thought it was terrible. But that's actually a pretty typical part of the process, which leads us into the next part of the process, which is to revise. When you're submitting articles for publication in a journal, you want to be willing to revise. Revise and resubmit is the most common decision that comes out. And many of those articles will ultimately be published. Revising can be a difficult process because as writers, we often get very personally invested into our written work. We invest a lot of our time and energy into it. We get attached to it. And sometimes it can hurt a little bit when folks are pointing out things that need to be changed, or when folks are calling for changing things that you just actually really liked about your piece. A mentor of mine used to say that revising in response to reviewer reports is an exercise in humility and diplomacy. You have to be willing to accept critique, and you also have to be able to talk back to the reviewers and to engage in conversation with them. The editor may mediate the comments that you receive from reviewers, and I think in particular, good editors will do this. So in other words, they'll help you see what the consistencies are across the reviews, and they may recognize the differences and let you know which of those they are more inclined to suggest that you follow. So what sometimes happens in reviewer reports is that reviewers will suggest different things. For instance, someone may say, oh, I really think you need to extend this literature review because you need to consider this body of sources that you haven't yet attended to. And another reviewer may say, I think you need to truncate your literature review in order to get more quickly to the results of your study and your analysis of them. And those are obviously competing recommendations. And so hopefully an editor will say, I recognize these differences. I think you should follow reviewer A or reviewer B or whatever it is. And so that will help you know, okay, how do I deal with this tension? They won't do that in all cases. And sometimes they will leave that up to you, or they may just flesh out kind of the pros and cons of each approach and say, given your goals, you have to decide which of these paths you want to go down. When you receive your reviewer reports, you'll likely also receive a letter from the editor. And so you'll receive maybe 2 reviewer reports or 3 reviewer reports, and then an additional report from the editor. you generally want to make the changes that the editor suggests. So if the editor says, I agree with reviewer two's suggestion that you blah, 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 you're very likely going to want to make that change. You can decide which other changes that the reviewer suggests you want to make and which you feel are doable. So in other words, if the editor doesn't highlight something or suggest something in particular from the reviewer reports, then it's your job to decide, okay, which of these things am I willing to tackle? Which do I agree with and do I accept? And what changes do I not want to make? And you can think that through when you're responding to the feedback that you received. It is not a good idea to decide that you don't want to make any changes that the reviewers or the editor have suggested. The editor is very unlikely to publish in response to that, even if you feel like you have a very good argument for why you want to keep things the way that they are. That's not to say that you have to make every change, and indeed, you probably couldn't or shouldn't, but you also want to be respectful of the fact that these changes were offered for a reason and you don't want to ignore them. I also recommend setting aside the feedback that you receive from the reviewers and the editors for a few days and then coming back to reread it. The initial response to reviewer reports and editor letters can be kind of emotional. And that might either be like you're totally excited and you want to begin revising right away, or you feel a little crestfallen that they weren't as excited about something as you thought that they would be, or maybe that they are requiring some pretty substantial revisions that are going to take a lot of time. And so it's good to set those aside, give yourself some time to process it, and then go back to them. Oftentimes that distance and space can give you a fresh perspective on the reviews and can help you understand them in a little bit of a less emotional kind of way. Excuse me. And the next step then is to resubmit. This is your opportunity to talk back to the reviews that you received. As with your initial submission, you want to include a cover letter that outlines your revisions. Many times editors will stipulate this. They will ask you when you resubmit to please outline the changes that you made in response to the reviewers. You want to make sure to thank the editor and the reviewers for their time, for their input, and for their feedback, and show that you have carefully read and considered the reviewers' comments. That means responding to them specifically, as reviewer 2 suggested, or as both reviewers indicated, or as you, the editor, such and such. Because you want to make clear that you have considered carefully what the reviewers have asked you to do. You also then want to express hope for next steps. You don't want to be presumptuous, but you do want to indicate that you're hopeful for a positive outcome, so that you look forward to the possibility of your article being published in an upcoming issue of the journal. As before, I just want to show you an example of what this resubmission letter might look like. Again, I realize the type is small here. And again, this may be different in terms of how you're asked to give your resubmission. So it might be an online field. There might be something that you have to fill out in the resubmission. But as I mentioned, you want to start with an acknowledgement of the reviewer and the editor's work, and to thank them, and to address the specific concerns that they have. So in this case, I indicate here, to address the concerns of reviewers, I've made the following changes, and go through and enumerate those. This is where you can see that, and this is where the specific changes that I made in response to those. You'll see that in this example, a reviewer did sign the review, and so I was able to talk directly to that particular reviewer. And so you want to think about having those components to the review. This helps the resubmission, excuse me. This helps to instantiate the idea that scholarship is participation in an ongoing scholarly conversation. And so you want kind of the meta materials that surround your article also to engage in that. You're not going to push an article through based upon the cover letter, but it does help the editor to see how you responded to feedback. It does help the reviewers to see which of their recommendations you took and why, and which you didn't and why, so that they perhaps don't get hung up on, gosh, I remember I suggested this and I see that the writer didn't do it. But when you give the information about, oh, I thoughtfully considered a reviewer 3's suggestion, but I chose not to pursue it, and here's why, that helps to show that you're willing to explain, negotiate, talk, and converse with the larger scholarly community that you are seeking to become a member of. If you have questions about submitting an journal article for publication in a journal or the strategies for getting your article published, I encourage you to reach out to the Writing Center. We are here to support you in your journey. The contact information for the Writing Center is displayed on the slide that's currently visible there for you. You can reach out to us over email or phone. You can visit us in 216 College Hall, which is our main location. I also encourage you to schedule an appointment with one of the Writing Center's consultants to talk about your writing, to talk about your questions about submitting to a journal. Some members of our staff have been through that process, particularly if you meet with one of the graduate student members of our staff, but they have perhaps worked with other folks on journal articles who are submitting in the process. We work with faculty members who receive revise and resubmits who have successfully landed their publications after working with us. And so please use us as a resource that can help you get that article published and out to an audience and into the hands of readers. I'm appreciative for your attention and time during the presentation today, and I would be grateful for your feedback. Speaking about larger scholarly conversations, if you would please visit the URL that's up on the slide there or scan that QR code and answer a few questions about today's presentation, I would be grateful. That helps me know moving forward what information to include and ways that we can make presentations from the Writing Center valuable. Thank you for your time and good luck with your writing.
Thank you so much. That was so informative.
Great. Let me get back so I can see you.
All righty.